Welcome to Beyond the Headlines. I'm Caroline Locker, and today we're talking about Expo 67 and how it changed the face of Montreal forever. With me, I have Professor Rhona Richman-Kenneally. She's chair of the Department of Design and Computation Arts here at Concordia. She's also one of the co-editors of this book, Expo 67, Not Just a Souvenir. This is a collection of essays on all aspects of Expo 67, from food to women to architecture and to national identity. Also with me, Germaine Ying-Gee Wong, one of Canada's most distinguished filmmakers. We're here today not for your capacity as a filmmaker, but because you've played another very special role in Canadian culture. You were one of the hostesses at Expo 67, Man and His World. Thank you very much to both of you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Now, I'd like to start by giving just a few numbers about Expo 67. 250 million tons of soil moved into the St. Lawrence River to create two islands, Île Notre-Dame and Île Sainte-Hélène, which were going to become the site of the Expo. 50 million visitors came to visit this. Now, at that time, Montreal had less than 3 million people living in the city. 50 million visitors. We also had 67 different restaurants and 15,000 waiters. Now, Rhona, this was Montreal and indeed Canada thinking big.
Thinking very big, and I just want to modify one small thing, 50 million visits. And so people like me who couldn't stand to be there once, twice, 10 times, visited many times. And so what we say is the turnstile turned 50 million times, an extraordinary number.
Now, beyond the numbers, what did Expo 67 represent for Canada and for the city of Montreal?
And for a 10-year-old girl, in my case. So it was an extraordinary environment, and I think one of the most wonderful things today is that we have the opportunity of Germaine to talk about it from an insider's perspective, somebody who understood the land, the space, the environment, and then from my excited little eyes of 10 years old, having the opportunity to look at it again from the perspective of a professor, somebody who trained as an architect, you're going to get the merging of all multiple perspectives today. And that's not a surprise, because Expo 67 and Man in His World lent itself to multiple perspectives, to layers of perception, to the development of a liminal and an interlocking environment that brought Montreal in its newfound glory into another world, into kind of a dreamlike environment. And there was literally something for everybody, and the result was sensational.
And the Expo itself started in 1967, but in subsequent years, there was Man in His World, which was on the same site, which was an opportunity for Montrealers to keep going and keep seeing what it had been like. Now, Germaine, you were one of the very famous hostesses. These hostesses were selected across Canada, 235 of them for Expo 67. And I'd like to start by just showing a picture of one of the typical hostesses so we can have an idea. Here she is on the cover of the Montreal Star, this hostess, Anne Stevenson, in her typical uniform. And here we have a few of these hostesses in all types of different cultural uniforms from different cultural backgrounds. The hostesses were selected for their beauty, for their diplomatic skills, for their knowledge of Canadian history and geography, and for their friendliness. Do you remember what it was like to be selected for that?
Well, I think based on the adjectives that you just used, I don't think I would have qualified. But
you did.
Yeah, I did. And I remember the interview process. I applied because I thought it was a wonderful opportunity, but I didn't really know what I was applying for. I mean, I knew it was for being a hostess, but I wasn't aware of exactly the environment or the opportunities or the responsibilities. But during the interview process, I was told quite quickly that I was much too young, because they were
How
looking.
old were you then?
I was 16, 17.
Wow.
But they were looking for young women, and I was really a girl, I think. But because I spoke English, French, Chinese, and Spanish, I think I became very attractive to them. And I got the job, but I think I got the job on that basis.
So tell us, what was it like being a hostess?
Well, it was, I don't think I could have ever had any expectations that could have, sort of mirrored the actual experience of working there. It was, I was pretty typical of many young girls in Montreal, that if they went to a Catholic school, our experiences were very limited. I mean, we were raised essentially by our families and by nuns. So our knowledge of the world, our knowledge of Canada was very minimal. And being probably quite a bit younger than most of the other hostesses, my lack of knowledge was even more. I felt it more, certainly. But it was, I think, an extraordinary opportunity as a first job to be thrown into a somewhat artificial environment, but probably the most ideal environment you could ever imagine, because for a young girl who had never traveled, the world came to us. I mean, we had the whole world within walking distance and within arm's reach. I mean, it was extraordinary.
Did you find that it changed your life?
Oh,
Your view
yes.
of the world at that time?
Yes, it was, and not just for me. I think that for many of the hosts and hostesses that worked there, as well as for many of the visitors, and I think maybe probably most Canadians, the experience was an extraordinary departure. Because I think in Canada we were fairly insular. This was a period where, we didn't travel a lot. Our knowledge of the world was not that great. Montreal was a city, but it wasn't very urbane, And suddenly we were thrown into this environment where we met people from all over the world. We were exposed to art forms, not only extraordinary art forms, but diverse art forms. So we were introduced to music, to paintings, to sculpture, architecture, engineering feats that I think for a young mind, these were all very unimaginable things. So in my particular case, Expo and Man in His World basically flung the doors open. And if I was ambitious or curious before that experience, I became unstoppable afterwards, because the whole world was at my feet, literally.
Wow.
So there was nothing to stop me from accomplishing whatever I set myself. From a naive 16, 17-year-old, I became a very different person. And it was very interesting, because it was not just in terms of the introduction to arts, but it was also an introduction to people. I had not known very many people from different cultures before that, because I grew up in Verdun. And Verdun is a blue-collar working-class neighborhood that was predominantly white. I mean, I was the only Asian person. There was one black girl, and there was one Italian, and that was exotic in those days. So, and then suddenly I met people from Trinidad, Tobago, I met people from Russia, from every part of the world. And what was extraordinary about that, but that was a very formative experience for me, because from having gone from no experience to this experience, there was no sense of racism or social status, because we were all in the same place, essentially doing the same things. Yeah. So, I mean, what a fabulous way to, see the world and to become part of this world.
Sounds like so much fun. You actually did have a job to do. Can you tell us about what your job consisted of?
Well, I was a hostess. I didn't belong to a particular pavilion. I was often called to attend official functions, to greet dignitaries, so I met exceptional people.
Who was your favorite?
Well, I met the Shah of Iran and his wife, who I thought was just beautiful. And that was my first experience of caviar. Of course, I just thought it was fish eggs, so I ate a half a liter, which today is very embarrassing, but anyhow. I also met Buckminster Fuller, But having seen the geodesic dome before actually meeting the man didn't correspond at all to what I imagined, the
Why not?
creator. Well, because the geodesic dome was such an incredibly awesome structure that somehow I expected to meet an awesome person, larger than life. But he was very humble, very modest, very sort of docile. It was extraordinary, yeah.
The exhibit itself, Expo 67, is before anything else an exhibit about design and architecture and technology. Was Montreal at that time avant-garde in that field?
It was. Montreal was a laboratory for all things that were exciting and modern. But what I'm really thrilled about, Caroline, is the fact that we started with Germaine, because my architecture sensibility and my sensibility as a design professor is really to exaggerate and bring attention to how significant the spaces are because they were lived environments, because you walked through the space, because you wore the uniform, because your job was to create the interface between the architecture, the amazing designs, and the humans that were Montreal in all of their multi-ethnic, in the case of what you were talking about, perspective. So the buildings were amazing. Mm-hmm. They were extraordinary,
and a lot of them were temporary and were taken down right after.
Well, what was unanticipated was actually the fact that some of them were to remain, because they were always perceived as being temporary. And so the French Pavilion becoming the casino, mm-hmm. or the geodesic dome of the U.S. Pavilion sustaining mm-hmm. itself in a variety of iterations is really the surprise. What I found wonderful, and what you made me think of, Germaine, when we talked about the Bucky Dome, Buckminster Fuller's Dome, is last week I was in Chicago at the airport, flying back to Montreal, and when I looked at the signage, the electronic signage that identified the destination of the plane I was going on, Montreal was represented by, guess what, the geodesic dome.
Really?
So we talk about the vibrancy of that environment and of the architecture. It lives in the present day, and one of the reasons was because it was so extraordinary as an experimental site, but really because people like Germaine and the visitors themselves and the designers and the chefs in the restaurants created something that was so vibrant that it went under people's skin and became abidingly powerful.
Now I want to show just one of the pictures of, this is the Quebec Pavilion, a beautiful glass building. This one was taken down, wasn't it? Incredible, such architecture, such work for such a short period of time.
And an extraordinary pavilion for a number of reasons. One, the fact that it had an amazing restaurant, and I think we're going to be talking about food a fair bit.
Yes, we will.
But there emanated from that restaurant a kind of friendly competition between the Quebec chefs and the Canadian chefs about who would carry the heritage of Quebec food and Canadian food with the most kind of resonance of sophistication. And indeed, in the Quebec restaurant, there was a very intense collaboration amongst the chefs in Montreal at the time to create a really definitive menu. And the fact that the expectation was that it would be represented by Quebec and rather than by Canada was considered a really important point.
How interesting. We touched a little bit about what a fascinating time the 60s was for women, of course, a big moment of affirmation. And I have a quote here from one of the chapters of the book called Girl Watching at Expo 67, because there was a lot of girl watching going on. And it says, they were chosen for their beauty, talking about the hostesses, constantly on display, clearly objects of male attention and desire, while at the same time they were enacting the new social roles for women in the 1960s, participating in the workforce, confidently claiming public space, and embracing new modern clothes as a way of liberating themselves. Now, what a contradiction this was, and what a special time for women in general, and both of you were part of that.
Well, this woman was still a girl.
Yes, you were 10 years old.
I was 10 years old, but I thought that the hostesses were extraordinary. I mean, we talked already about the uniforms and how they may not have been the most comfortable to wear. The weight of them in the summertime would have been a consideration. The expectation of glamour and sophistication that came from looking at those women who were the communicators of the dream and the vision, right? The physical manifestation of all of the aspirations of Expo 67. 1967. They were extraordinary, and there were really two groups of women. Germaine talks about the ones that were hired by the city and that represented the site as a whole, whether Expo 67 or Man in His World. But each pavilion also had its own group of hostesses who came from the country in question and who wore a uniform that was very carefully modulated to represent the country and show what was extraordinary. So whether you think about the women in the Japanese pavilion in their extraordinary kimonos, or the saris from the women in India, the pavilion, various other ones, that was a really careful way to create an environment that people could look at with two very interesting and in some ways contradictory or paradoxical perspectives. One, to feel that they could have an immediate association, right? So when Germaine goes over and answers questions, it's a really personalized way to bring Expo or Man in His World to people. But on the other hand, there's that sense of extraordinary, of dreamlike, of phantasmagoria, which was a word that was Walter Benjamin used, for example, related to exhibitions of this kind.
And what a contradiction that women were the window into this world and that the theme was Man in His World. Was that mentioned?
Expo was an environment of contradictions.
Yes, it was.
It was a fascinating environment of contradictions. It was Canada was congratulating itself on having achieved 100 years of maturity, moving from a small environment to something that was to a country that was playing itself out on an international scheme.
Yes. Now, can we talk about national identity and what this event and the subsequent years meant for Canada, for Quebec, and for Montreal? Because it was very much a microcosm of a world that you don't find anywhere else in the world, and certainly that you don't find in everyday streets in Montreal. So what did this event mean for Montrealers and for Canadians?
Well, ironically, its tentacles did come out into the everyday streets of Montreal, in the sense that it was a stimulus for all kinds of development in terms of urban planning, in terms of architecture and design. You mentioned this earlier. I.M. Pei, who was a very distinguished international architect, came to Montreal and collaborated with ARCOP for Place du Mairie. And I think the symbolic significance of that is not lost on people who have been investigating this. So the first icon of the crucifix in Montreal was the one that was supposedly planted by Jacques Cartier in the name of the king when he first came to the city. The crucifix then moved to a different perspective, something that you look down on from an airplane, the fantasy of Saint-Exupéry and Le Petit Prince, only when you look down on it, it was the cross of Place du Mairie. And so you change perspective, you change materials, you change ideologies from a religious and a colonial mentality to one that's international and has modernism at its core. But in some ways, the icon stays the same. It's still the symbol of the cross, and it's still a recognition both of the cultural heritage of Montreal in creating that line between Mount Royal and Expo, because of course that symbol then was there because Expo 67 allowed people to spend money and pay attention to the kind of transitions that would put us on the international map, right? So there is this this migration of traditional to modern, and indeed ultra-modern, because Expo was always envisioned as what would life in the future be about. So when you looked at the pavilion, the American pavilion and the Soviet pavilion, for example, with their astronauts and their discussion about landing on the moon, they showed rockets and Yuri Gagarin's, the language, the narrative of those two superpowers at the time of the Cold War certainly, created this kind of big question mark. I was going through the memorabilia of Expo 67, and one of the most powerful advertisements was, in the years leading up to Expo, this fabulous ad that said, there is a Soviet structure being built 40 miles from the American border. Aren't you curious about it?
What
it
a
was
great
the
ad.
Soviet pavilion,
Wow.
right?
That was
So in the major voice, you had nationalism, centenary, aren't we all happy that we've hit the point where we can attract an international audience, 50 million hits as you talked about. And on the other hand, there are all kinds of things playing out that are much more complicated. What is the paradox? That in Quebec, nationalism is being contested as we speak. Pierre Valliere is in jail that summer because of what would ultimately be, and what had been already, a series, a desire for recognition of a different kind of nationalism. Of course, Charles de Gaulle adds salt and pepper to this recipe by pronouncing at
the most famous quote ever said about Quebec.
Just about, Vive le Québec libre, which of course was a call to arms for people who thought that Quebec should be its own country.
And it was while he was visiting Expo that he said that?
He said that at the City Hall, and yes, he was in Montreal for the occasion.
And I think he was invited to Ottawa, but never made it quite
made it to Ottawa. Was encouraged to be whisked off the Expo site, but apparently the powers that were in Montreal said no, he's going to come to Expo. We're going to give him an opportunity to have a visit, but apparently there was a whole scurry afterward, and although he did attend the Expo site, he wasn't able to complete the itinerary in the way that he was meant to. Yeah. So paradox everywhere.
I just want to read another quick passage from the book, because I think this is absolutely fascinating in terms of trying to find this national identity. And it's from Chatelaine magazine at that time, trying to tell people what they should wear and how they should come to the Expo. And it says, "Don't forget that to our guests from overseas, every Canadian is on show too. The item adopts a stern tone towards visitors from rural areas and small towns across Canada, reminding them that this was no ordinary fare for honky-tonk atmosphere, and admonishing especially the close to 500,000 campers among them to bring at least one outfit of much more urban type than you would usually take on a camping trip." Now, we're talking about people from rural areas, people from small city, and what was becoming a very cosmopolitan Montreal. This was Canada trying to find itself.
In many ways, sartorially, but also in a variety of other ways too. So for example, part of the Canada Pavilion was designed to accommodate 2 Inuit sculptors who were brought down from the north, who actually lived with a family in Montreal, and who carved Inuit sculpture narratives into the plaster of, as it turns out, the Tundra restaurant at Expo 67. What's fascinating is that is an adding of layers from architecture and design that was indigenous to Canada, recognized as being something that was worthy of promotion, very much so, because it was such extraordinary art. But what becomes fascinating is that First Nations art in general is actually gathered and sent by Canadian missives, in other words, with the assistance of the Canadian government all around the world, as an example of what Canada can do. And the layering of modernism and of indigenous design in this very complex way becomes an articulation of a kind of nationalist gesture in terms of artistic practice. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So partly art was expressed by having Alexander Calder erect sculptures on the Expo site, but it's also a reconsideration of Canadian literature, of Canadian fine arts, of Canadian design, and really kind of coming up to recognize that these things were amazing. There was a cookbook that was assembled by some women crossing Canada and visiting the kitchens of people in their houses. It was called the Laura Secord Cookbook. And many of the people watching this will know that Laura Secord is actually the name of a candy store that has branches all across Canada. And the pride of this Laura Secord cookbook, which comes around this time in the late 1960s, of a Canadian cuisine is manifest. And in their preface,
is that the first time we could call something Canadian cuisine?
I think that's a really important resonance. I'm not sure if it's the first time, but it's certainly a really significant time. In the preface, they say, "We can say this with all sureness. There is a Canadian cuisine, and it is unique in all the world." What was unique about it? The collective approach to it, that it is partly of the region that it came from, so specific berries from the prairies, specific fish from the maritime provinces, but in the permutations and combinations which bring together the different ethnicities and cultures of Canada, the change over time of these kinds of culinary experiences, the sharing and exchange between different cultural heritages of different foods, that constituted Canadian identity. And it was that mélange that was recognized as being, it didn't have to be exclusive. The exclusivity was in the collectiveness. I think that was really interesting because bilingualism and biculturalism soon became multilingualism and multiculturalism in the Canadian
and the symbol
context.
of this country.
Exactly. And so Expo just was one of the many incentives and one of the many stimuli for thinking of us as an us that could be a we that was a collective Canada.
Fascinating.
But you know, I think that, I mean, I have some real doubts about a lot of things, but I think that there were people that had fabulous visions of what Expo could be. But I think how those visions were played out, you know, they were varied.
Can you give us some examples?
Well, I sort of feel that the whole thing about Canadian identity, you know, as a person who worked, I don't know that I was ever conscious of being on a quest of identity, ever. I think for me, we were on a constant high. But it wasn't a high that was, you know, from drug or stuff like that. It was a high from people. And to me, that is what is extraordinary. But, you know, I think that the Canadian identity, I don't know that we ever, I mean, I represented Canada, but I don't really feel that I was a representative of Canada. I felt the whole time I worked, I felt like a sponge, that I just had to take it all in. And there weren't, I mean, I was very disappointed that I had to sleep because there wasn't enough time to see everything, to meet everyone, and to experience everything. And I think that that was the common denominator for certainly the people who worked on the site.
And it's fascinating that you bring this up because, as you say, during that time, you didn't realize perhaps that this was going to bring so much change to yourself, to the city, to the country. Do you think it's just now, Rhona, that we're getting enough distance to be able to put this kind of view on the event?
The answer to that would be yes and no, if we're going to stay with paradox. No, because I think that there have been people thinking about Expo 67 all along, although you're right, there have been a series of studies very recently. It's a kind of an assumption for historians that if you pass 2 generations, which is 40 years, then it's history, because it's in human memory, obviously, but not as something that's so immediate that it's still playing itself out. So in a way, it's something that happened then and is now getting a historical engagement. But there's a continuity around Expo that Joanne Sloan, who worked with me on this, who was fantastic in, developing a perspective. Her area was fine arts. She's a Concordia professor as well. She's a professor in the art history department at Concordia. And where I think we were most effective was in our ability to kind of modulate the interdisciplinarity of the engagement. And the Expo book, represents the work of art historians, architects, sociologists, people in communication studies, a wide variety of areas of expertise, and now Germaine as a filmmaker. And I see this as volume 2 of the Expo book in many ways, and I'm absolutely delighted that you're able to contribute in this way. But I think that the continuity was really manifested as we started to take our Expo 67 Man in His World message on the road, as it were, and interact with people who were responding to this. And it was inevitable that people would, we talked about it in a variety of venues, and people would say, yeah, I remember, and I have a souvenir, and the souvenir has been sitting in my drawer for 20 to 25 years. My mother gave me this photograph when I was leaving home, and all those kinds of mnemonics, all those kinds of evocations of memory have allowed for the continuity. I think what's really nice as a scholar looking back at this, as an academic, is the interdisciplinary focus on academia in general, so much reinforced by Concordia, because one of the key signatures of Concordia is interdisciplinarity, and Germaine and I are both representatives of Concordia. Her degree is from Concordia as well. And so that interdisciplinarity, helped us look at what was a very interdisciplinary environment already and add breadth and depth to it, I think, I hope.
And this is how this book all started, through this conference, bringing people together to talk about their different perspectives of Expo 67. And of course, it brought you to start, I was going to say collecting, but finding objects and calling for people who still had souvenirs, artifacts, and making this wonderful exhibit with the CCA.
Right.
That I think that was in 2005, was it?
That's right.
And it was the first time we were bringing all these souvenirs together. And I think some we can still find on eBay today, and you brought us some that are from then. Some are menus, which I'll bring back in just a moment when we finally start talking about food, because we've been talking about food since the beginning. Here we have an apron. This was a souvenir that you could buy as a tourist, as a visitor.
Right.
And it has the different pavilions on it. How did you find this piece?
Well, I found it through eBay vicariously, by which I mean I know somebody who is an avid collector of Expo 67 memorabilia, who was absolutely supportive in helping us to amass much of it from his own collection, some of the souvenirs that you see on your table, and many, many, many more used for the exhibition. Look, I teach in a design department. What's absolutely abundantly clear to me and so pivotal, and something that I take up constantly with students who are studying design, who are seeing themselves as generating the momentum in terms of their design ethos as well as their expertise in becoming responsible designers, to think about what is the significance of cultural artifacts, these in particular, artifacts in general. And the answer is that they create an environment that then becomes an entangled space, a built environment where people and things and experiences all come together. And it's that collective experience, what happens when I interact with a building, with a food, when I watch a film and I feel the bodies of the other people in the space, when I think about the size of the screen in the room, the number of people, the lighting, it's that collective environment that gives us the profound opportunity to make a difference in our world by thinking about our responsibility as designers. When I look at the artifacts that come from Expo, what is so important to me is the degree to which they have become kind of opportunities to pluck out of that very complex environment certain characteristics of it that can then live on in their own right and yet bring me back to the original space.
And that's so fascinating, isn't it? Going from the think big and the immensity that was this event to the very, very simple objects. You brought your own passport from Expo 67 with a picture of you when you were 10 years old. And this little item represents such a huge event. And again, you start the book with such a lovely story about a postcard that you found. Do you want to tell us about this postcard and how it traveled?
Well, I'll tell you about the postcard, but then I'll try to riff a little bit on why I think the passport became so important. The postcard was one that Joanne Sloan, who co-edited the book with me, is an avid collector of postcards and indeed has a fascinating article on postcards and the vividness of the colors of the Expo 67 postcards, of the Quebec Pavilion in particular, which was the photograph that you showed before.
As you're talking, I'm just going to find one so we can show it as well to the camera.
So it was almost to our surprise that we looked at the text of one of the postcards, and it was a very simple statement, having a great time running to and fro. And it really captured, I thought, the movement, the momentum that Expo 67 was. And when we looked at that, we knew for sure that would become one of the beacons, a point of departure to think about Expo 67 and man and his world as complex environments that had to be experienced by interacting with them, by creating movement and literally entering into the postcards and being part of the display.
And they were works of art in themselves, absolutely beautiful.
They were extraordinary works of art. You talk about the passport as an invitation into that kind of interactivity. What's extraordinary about it is it's really a kind of a signal, a harbinger of I'm going into a new space. I need to have approval, some kind of imprimatur by virtue of this, that I have the authority to do so in the same way that I visit a new country. I think one of the extraordinary things about the passport is there's actually a little notice in there to say this passport is not meant to be what a passport really is, an opportunity to visit the actual countries, right?
Just in case you thought you were in a real world.
Or to continue the fantasy of going somewhere that wasn't really Montreal, that wasn't really a physical space, that was really this kind of dreamlike environment. So there was a kind of practical as well as a fantasy kind of experience. And I agree with Germaine. I don't think that constructions of nationalism were playing out necessarily by the individuals who participated at Expo. I think these were prescriptives that we were invited to embrace through various means by virtue of the organizers of the exposition itself, the people who organized the pavilions, who decided on the clothing, who decided on the menus, and who, put things out there for us, each in our own way, to embrace.
Now, we have to get into the food. You brought some menus, and just before we get into it, I want to ask Germaine what she remembers about the food, about the different restaurants.
Well, I remember going to, each pavilion had a restaurant, or almost all the pavilions had. And you have to put it in the context, and in those days, I ate Chinese food at home, and for me, I lived in a French neighborhood, so Canadian food was fairly limited. I mean, and so I was at Expo, Man in His World, and I was eating food from all kinds of countries. I don't remember whether I had to eat there, because as a hostess, we should be able to talk about, the pavilion, the country, its food.
If visitors had questions on the restaurants or the food.
So, I tried a lot of food. I tried my first Irish whiskey. How Irish it is, I have no idea. I ate in the Austrian pavilion. I ate my first trout and aspic, which I hated because it was cold, it was slimy, and it had tons of bones. But it was an incredible experience for that reason, because not having to go anywhere. You just had to walk like 30 seconds. Everything was there. We had a brasserie at the time that was called Le Gobelet. And Le Gobelet had its tavern on St. Lawrence, but it was limited to men only. Women and girls could not go in. But at Expo, they had a huge terrace. So, that was my first experience of beer. And pig's knuckles. It was from the perspective of food, it was pretty extraordinary. But I think what was really important, you touched on the whole subject of, things were built and conceived for a period fixed in time. But in fact, much of what had been done did carry over into becoming a very integral part of the fabric of certainly this city, Montreal. Because as I was working, I befriended a lot of people from all over the place, all over the world, I should say. And one big subject of discussion was, how do I stay in this country? So talk about being proud. This
you had
was
people
the greatest.
Asking you this?
But I remember the Czech pavilion, they had these extraordinary jewelers. And he wanted to stay. After Expo, he did not want to go back. And so we would discuss, what can you do? And he, in fact, did stay. And as a student, we were all students, we purchased a lot of jewelry. But for the sole purpose of giving these artists work so that they could survive, to stay here. So I have incredible pieces of jewelry from these artists that represented Czechoslovakia at the time.
Wow.
But I'd like to add another layer of this, because it's jewelry that brought you and me together in the first place. So a filmmaker and an architect came together in a jewelry class. And got to know each other, and that's when I met Germaine. That's when I found out that she was a hostess. So who's to say that?
Together.
Well, who's to say?
Wow.
And and also in terms of you know, the fallout from Expo. Before Expo, I was a student in modern languages. After Expo, I thought, well, the hell with that. I realized that, you know, there were such incredible expressions, stories, realities. And I saw also at Expo, you know, how everything was interconnected. So you had, at the base, you had people. I mean, they were the pivot of everything else. But you had, you know, ways of doing things, ways of seeing things, ways of being, and ways of saying. And so I also saw how you could explain or show how you are and who you are, not only by the foods you eat, the way you speak, what you say, but also about what you show. So from modern languages, I went into communication arts.
And today you're a filmmaker. Would you say
Well,
Expo
no,
67?
today I'm a retired grandmother, but
There was that part along the way.
that's right.
But really then a life-changing moment for you.
Yes, but not just for me. I mean, I think I was fairly typical of a lot of the hosts and hostesses at the period. You'd have to be completely thick-skinned not to have been caught up in this wave of curiosity and of, you know, the future's all open.
Just to finish on the food, you mentioned you tried trout for the first time. You also tried something for the first time.
Tried lobster for the first time.
And we actually have here a menu from that restaurant where you tried the lobster.
Well, there was this
There we go.
extraordinary
$2.50 for 3 halves of lobster.
Yeah, but
That was
and
expensive.
it was very expensive. The restaurants at Expo were considered
They were
to
high
be
class, weren't they?
They were considered to be very expensive. They stopped taking reservations after the first couple of weeks because they were just inundated. People lined up for hours and hours and hours.
Incredible.
for
Now,
the
I want to
restaurants.
talk about this Tundra restaurant because this was one of the 2 restaurants at the Canadian Pavilion. And it served things like beluga meat, bison meat, and what else did we have? We had...
Ojibwe kiwi sen.
yes, and the broth of... which animal's tail again? Was it
beaver's
tail? Now, this was supposed to be representing Canada, but which Canadian had really eaten this or had this kind of food on their everyday table?
Well, it represented an understanding of Canada, or a conceptualization of Canada, or maybe even an aspiration of Canada. It certainly was an attempt to show the diversity of Canada, gastronomically, geographically, of course, because a lot of the foods that we would think more exotic down here in the south were considered to be, you know, more appropriate near the Arctic Circle. So I would imagine that certain people who ate in that restaurant went away slightly confused to wonder whether it was our habit to eat these kinds of foods.
Especially Canadians.
All at the same
They must
well,
have been very confused.
yeah, exactly. But I think it was a very important gesture. I think it acknowledged a way of thinking about Canadian cuisine as both exotic and immediate, right? To try to reconceptualize Canadian cooking as not just bland. We were not just meat and potatoes people, but to aspire to something that could compete in a broader context with a more international way of thinking about food. So in fact, the menu itself was divided into international, Canadian, and I think the third category was continental, to show that diversity, again, to talk about a collective embracing of different kinds of cuisine. Perhaps the most interesting thing of that for me is that on the weekend that Expo opened, one of the local newspapers had an article in the Weekend magazine that translated the bison recipe into something that people could actually make in their homes. And there's this little asterisk. When you look on the bottom, at the bottom of the recipe to the corresponding asterisk, it's about, well, if you can't find bison, then just use beef. And so it's this lovely kind of translation down into the real world of the kind of fantasy world of Expo. So what's really great is, you know, you have your meal at the Tundra, you find the recipe transformed into something that you could actually cook, and then you put on your little pink apron and you go and you have the meal. And really what it is a kind of symbolic representation of what Germaine was talking about, what you take away with you afterward. So whether you do that by virtue of the memories and the desire to think about the representations and the communications to be inspired sufficiently to change your area of pursuit, of academic pursuit, or whether you bring it home as different souvenirs that then become part of a family narrative, you know, that works in conjunction with the myriad of photographs that people took and stories, because we all had relatives who came to Montreal. There's a district in Montreal where there was an unusual rise in the number of bathroom renovations in 1967. And I've always thought, well, how appropriate, because if your relative from Winnipeg was coming, what did you want to do but make sure your house was up to par? So you did these kinds of renovations. So the appropriation, the personalization of the story of the Expo and Man in His World experience happened in so many ways, intellectually, physically, in terms of the spaces that we lived, in our memories, in our stories, in our future narratives.
I think that's a wonderful way to finish this and to come full circle. We've spoken about food, we've spoken about toilets, we've spoken about architecture and national identity. Professor Rhona Richman-Kenneally and Germaine Ying-Gee Wong, thank you very much for being with us. This was Beyond the Headlines. I'm Caroline Locker. Thanks very much for listening.